Universities can become part of the process of mutually exploring the future by looking at the present in a different way, of starting to look at the way in which basic principles of living are actually engaged in. To give one example, in working in Melbourne, there's been a process called Future Melbourne. RMIT and the University of Melbourne both work together to think about what that future Melbourne would look like. And we stopped taking the cliches as given. So one of the cliches about cities is connectivity. And the view about connectivity is what you need is massive broadband, what you need is a way of connecting people by electronic communication. And what we said very simply was connectivity works across many levels. It includes walking around the city more easily. It includes having more sessions for talking. It includes having ideas festivals and invited speakers who come to a place who make a difference. And it includes, as well as that, the high-tech electronic dimensions of communications devices and so on. So what we argued, and I think the city has taken it on, is to try and think of itself as a knowledge city in a much more comprehensive sense rather than just information platforms. For me, smart cities' futures are the idea of actually anticipating current trajectories, but then not taking the futurology of that too seriously and going back to the present and saying, what do we have in our actual city? What do we have now, and how can we connect people together to think reflexively about how we're going to cope with future possibilities? Universities are central to smart cities because they have been part of the knowledge background of cities for so long, but left out of the contention when it comes to either policy making or thinking about engagement with both community and industry. For me, universities carry a weight that has hardly been touched. And when you take a university and start to treat it seriously as a place not for learning and teaching only, but for learning and teaching about the world, and then saying that world is the world that you engage in, both as a city and as a place within a global framework, then you're really saying to that university, make a difference. And that's when I think universities will actually come into their own. There are quite serious barriers to the way in which universities currently operate in relation to cities. They've barely recognised that they have a city that surrounds them. They've barely recognised that they have to engage locally as well as with their own particular industries or their own particular disciplines. So what happens with the university is that it's measured, it has outputs, it has considerations about how it meets government objectives. And because of those particular dimensions of its ways of thinking strategically, it stops thinking about its engagement in the city itself. Firstly, it tends to emphasise a particular discipline which is global, and it has to get a certain number of publications out. Secondly, it has to get a certain number of grants out. And thirdly, most of its attraction points are sent on or focused on bringing in international students so that they can just meet their budget requirements. For me, if they were to overcome those, it would be think much more broadly and laterally about how they can engage both globally and within a city at the same time, and think about the city as the local place of engagement as the strongest part of their way of thinking in the world. What would make a huge difference is to make that central to their work planning, to actually say to university lecturers, we want you to engage in the local community. We want you to think about the ways in which that can make a difference in the world. And there are untapped possibilities for that in the ways in which, say, students can be drawn into industry placements, local community placements, engagements which take them from the local all the way through to the global, where they can be involved in local community activities at a great distance. We've found at the universities that I've been engaging with that by putting in place that as a kind of process which gives people incentives to make it their key dimension, then students love it and the researchers actually get a lot of benefit out of it as well, and the teaching becomes a better way of being. We've been working in Papua New Guinea. The Minister for Community Development came to RMIT in 2004 and brought to us a proposal around a way of doing community engagement. And she said, as the Community Development Department, we're the weakest department in the whole of the country. We're the one which is looked down upon as a pseudo-welfare department which has very little power, is always overridden by those people within the mining industry or the finance industry or whatever happens to be. And yet, at the same time, most of our economy is based upon community and informal economy. How can we think about this differently? And what she brought, a remarkable woman called Dame Carol Kiddu, brought to us was a problem, but she also brought to us a sensibility which we were already working with. We then did a 14 community survey across the country in 5 provinces. We interviewed 1,000 people. We developed a way of thinking about community learning centres. We did literature surveys. We had a staff of about 30 people working on it. And those people from the top worked on it from the university side, and they worked on it from the departmental side. But we also had people at the local level working on it, and they became partners in the process of doing research. Those interviews made a difference. We put propositions to government. A new policy was formed in 2007. It went through the government's parliament and was passed as law. And now they have a completely different way of dealing with community. Not as welfare recipients, not as people who get third-way treatment and then are ignored, but rather as partners in the process of development. And that development's not seen as now big project development, massive mining industry development. It's now seen as the strength of those places are its communities. 97% of people live on customary land. That land, those people, that's the strength of that country, and they're now thinking about that as a different way of engaging in the whole future of how they operate. Firstly, the idea that the process is long-term rather than a short-term fix. It's long-term and it's a long-term partnership. The second thing is that it's surrounded by dialogue, and it's dialogue which is uncomfortable rather than dialogue which is easy, which allows different voices and dissenting voices to come to the fore. And then the third thing is that that community needs to know, when it does do that engagement, that it's not a fey process of consultation. It's not one of those processes which a community has had its time taken away from it and it just ends up becoming another picture show for a politician. It has to be that there is a possibility, not an inevitability, but a possibility that those points of dialogue will actually make their way into policy. And if they don't, then they become part of an explanation rather than simply a fobbing off that too often occurs. So there are many things. That becomes long-term engagement, dialogue, discussion, and comfort with discomfort. The idea that you simply take on uncomfortable ideas and you work them through, so you work out what their consequences are rather than dismissing them because they appear improbable at the time.